Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button right now.
Let me tell you about the greatest robbery in American history. It wasn't executed by masked men with guns. There were no alarms, no police chases, no arrests. The thieves wore suits and ties, sat in marble buildings in Washington, and operated completely within the law. Between 2020 and 2022, they stole approximately 30% of your purchasing power and transferred it directly to the wealthiest Americans. The weapon they used? A printing press. The victims? Anyone who works for a living instead of owning assets? And the truly diabolical part? Most people still don't realize they've been robbed. Picture this scenario and see if it sounds familiar. In 2020, you were house hunting. You had saved $30,000, feeling proud of your financial discipline. Houses in your neighborhood were listed at $300,000. You needed $60,000 for a proper down payment, so you were exactly halfway to your goal. You told yourself that with 2 more years of dedication and sacrifice, you would achieve the American dream of homeownership. You made your budget spreadsheets, cut unnecessary expenses, and watched your savings account grow month by month. You were doing everything right according to the conventional wisdom about building wealth through hard work and saving. Then something happened that changed everything. The COVID-19 pandemic arrived, the economy shut down, and the Federal Reserve made a decision that would fundamentally alter your financial future. They announced unlimited quantitative easing, a term so deliberately obscure that most Americans had no idea what it meant. What it actually meant was this: the Federal Reserve was going to create trillions of dollars out of thin air and inject them into the financial system. No physical printing was required. They simply made digital entries in bank accounts, crediting financial institutions with freshly created money that hadn't existed seconds before. The official justification sounded reasonable enough. The economy was in freefall. Businesses were closing their doors. Unemployment was spiking to levels not seen since the Great Depression. The stock market had crashed 35% in a single month. Something had to be done, they insisted, or we would face economic catastrophe. The Federal Reserve positioned itself as the hero riding to the rescue, using its extraordinary powers to save the American economy from collapse. Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell appeared on television and solemnly declared that the Fed would do whatever it takes to support the economy. Unlimited resources would be deployed. No expense would be spared. It sounded noble, even heroic. But here's what they didn't tell you during those reassuring press conferences and carefully worded statements. That money they created, all $4.5 trillion of it, wasn't going to you. It was going to banks, financial institutions, and the people already wealthy enough to own significant assets. While you were stuck at home, worried about your job and your health, the largest wealth transfer in modern history was taking place behind closed doors in the financial markets. Fast forward to 2022, just 2 years after you were halfway to your down payment goal. That $300,000 house you had been saving for now costs $450,000. The goalposts didn't just move, they were launched into a different zip code entirely. You continued saving diligently during those 2 years and managed to add another $20,000 to your down payment fund, bringing your total to $50,000. You should feel accomplished, except now you need $90,000 for a down payment on that same house. You went from being 50% of the way to your goal to being only 55% of the way there. Despite 2 years of sacrifice and saving, you are further from home ownership than when you started. Meanwhile, your rent increased from $1,200 to $1,800 per month. Your grocery bill jumped from $300 to $500 monthly. Filling up your gas tank went from $30 to $50. Healthcare costs continued their relentless climb upward. Every single expense in your life increased by 25 to 40%. But your salary? That went up by maybe 5 to 7%, if you were lucky enough to get a raise at all. The mathematics of your situation became impossible. You were running on a treadmill that kept speeding up while someone was simultaneously pushing you backward. This is not a story about bad luck. This is not about making poor financial choices or failing to work hard enough. This is a story about systematic wealth extraction executed by the Federal Reserve through a mechanism that most Americans don't understand because it's been deliberately obscured with technical jargon and economic doublespeak. Quantitative easing, monetary policy accommodation, liquidity injection, asset purchase programs. These phrases are designed to make your eyes glaze over, to make you think the subject is too complex for ordinary people to grasp. But strip away the fancy language and what remains is breathtakingly simple. The Federal Reserve created $4.5 trillion in new money and gave it to people who were already rich, allowing them to buy assets before prices adjusted upward, while you were left holding currency that was being devalued in real time. Let me explain exactly how this mechanism works, because understanding it is the first step toward protecting yourself from the next round of theft. When the Federal Reserve conducts quantitative easing, they are not actually printing physical dollar bills. They are creating money electronically through digital accounting entries. The Fed credits bank accounts at major financial institutions with newly created dollars. In exchange, these banks sell the Fed their holdings of treasury bonds and mortgage-backed securities. This transaction accomplishes several things simultaneously. First, it removes these bonds and securities from the bank's balance sheets, replacing them with cash. Second, it expands the Federal Reserve's own balance sheet as they accumulate these assets. Third, and most importantly, it floods the financial system with fresh liquidity that banks can now deploy. Before the 2008 financial crisis, the Federal Reserve's balance sheet totaled approximately $800 billion. This represented decades of normal monetary operations. Then came the Great Financial Crisis, and the Fed began its first major experiment with quantitative easing. By 2020, after multiple rounds of these programs, their balance sheet had grown to $4 trillion, a five-fold increase. Then COVID-19 struck, and the Fed abandoned any pretense of restraint. In just 24 months, from March 2020 to March 2022, they added another $4.5 trillion to their balance sheet. They created more money in 2 years than had been created in the entire previous century combined. The scale of this monetary expansion is difficult to comprehend, but the consequences are all around you every time you look at housing prices, grocery bills, or your retirement savings goals. Now comes the critical question that reveals the entire con. Where did that $4.5 trillion actually go? The answer exposes the fundamental injustice of the system. That money went to banks and financial institutions, not to you, not to small business owners struggling to survive lockdowns, not to workers who lost their jobs. It went to the largest financial institutions in America, the same banks that were bailed out in 2008, the same institutions that were already profitable and well capitalized. JP Morgan Chase received enormous liquidity. Bank of America saw their cash positions swell. Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, Citigroup, all of them were flooded with freshly created money. And what did these banks do with their windfall? They didn't increase lending to ordinary Americans in any meaningful way. Lending to consumers and small businesses remained relatively stagnant because banks viewed such loans as risky during an economic crisis. Instead, they invested the money in assets. They bought stocks, corporate bonds, real estate securities, and every other asset class that promised returns. They also lent money to wealthy clients at extraordinarily low interest rates, enabling those clients to leverage up and buy even more assets. This created a feeding frenzy in asset markets that lasted for nearly 2 years. The stock market, which had crashed to 2,300 on the S&P 500 index in March 2020, recovered within months and then soared to new all-time highs. By the end of 2021, the S&P 500 had climbed above 4,800, more than doubling from the March 2020 lows. If you owned $1 million in stocks when the pandemic began, you now had over $2 million. You had gained $1 million in wealth while sitting on your couch, doing absolutely nothing productive. Your stocks appreciated purely because the Federal Reserve printed money that flowed into equity markets, driving prices higher regardless of underlying business fundamentals. Real estate experienced a similar explosion. The median home price in the United States went from $320,000 in early 2020 to $420,000 by late 2022. That represents a 30% increase in less than 3 years. But this wasn't because there was suddenly a 30% increase in the quality of housing stock or because construction materials became 30% more valuable. Housing prices increased because cheap money was chasing a limited supply of homes. Investors, both individual and institutional, borrowed at near zero interest rates and purchased properties as fast as they could close deals. Companies like Blackstone and Invitation Homes deployed billions of dollars to acquire tens of thousands of single-family homes, converting them to rental properties. They were able to do this because the Federal Reserve's policies made borrowing essentially free while simultaneously signaling that asset prices would continue rising. Here's what makes this wealth transfer so insidious. If you didn't own assets before the money printing began, you got completely shut out of the gains. Worse than shut out, you actually fell further behind because while asset prices were climbing 30 to 40%, your wages were increasing by maybe 5 to 7% at best. The gap between asset owners and wage earners widened dramatically, rapidly, and by design. The Federal Reserve knew this would happen. They have economists and researchers who understand these dynamics perfectly. They made a conscious choice to prioritize protecting asset values over protecting the purchasing power of ordinary workers. Let me give you a concrete example that illustrates the brutality of this system. Meet Sarah, a composite character based on millions of real Americans. Sarah graduated from college in 2015 with $40,000 in student loan debt. She landed a decent job paying $50,000 annually. After taxes, student loan payments of $400 monthly, and rent of $1,200 per month, she managed to save about $500 each month through careful budgeting. She skipped vacations, drove an old car, rarely ate at restaurants, and slowly built her savings account. By early 2020, she had accumulated $30,000 and was actively house hunting. Properties in her area cost around $300,000. She needed $60,000 for a 20% down payment to avoid private mortgage insurance. She was exactly halfway to her goal and feeling optimistic about achieving home ownership within 2 years. Then the pandemic hit and the Federal Reserve printed $4.5 trillion. Housing prices in Sarah's area exploded upward. By 2022, that same $300,000 house now carried a price tag of $450,000. Sarah needed $90,000 for her down payment. During those 2 years, she had continued her disciplined saving and added another $20,000, bringing her total to $50,000. But the target had moved from $60,000 to $90,000. She was further from home ownership in absolute terms than she had been before she started saving. The goal had receded faster than she could chase it. Meanwhile, Sarah's monthly expenses increased dramatically due to inflation. Her rent jumped from $1,200 to $1,800, consuming an additional $600 monthly or $7,200 annually. Her grocery bill increased from $300 to $500 per month, another $2,400 per year. Gas costs rose by approximately $1,000 annually. Healthcare premiums increased. Utilities went up. Every category of spending expanded while her paycheck grew only modestly. Her salary increased from $50,000 to $55,000 over those 5 years, about a 10% raise. After taxes, that's roughly $4,000 more in take-home pay annually. But her expenses had increased by over $10,000 per year. She was $6,000 worse off annually in real terms, and the house she wanted to buy now required $24,000 more for a down payment. Sarah had been lapped by monetary policy. She was moving backward despite working hard, saving diligently, and making responsible financial choices. This wasn't due to personal failure. This was the direct result of Federal Reserve policies that inflated asset prices beyond her reach, while simultaneously inflating her cost of living and keeping her wages stagnant. She had been systematically impoverished by people she didn't elect, implementing policies she didn't vote for, to benefit people who didn't need help. Now let's contrast Sarah's experience with someone who already owned assets when the pandemic began. Meet Robert, another composite based on real wealth outcomes. Robert owned a home worth $300,000 with a $200,000 mortgage at 3% interest. His monthly housing payment was approximately $1,000. He also had $200,000 invested in a diversified stock portfolio. When COVID-19 struck and the Federal Reserve began printing money, Robert's financial situation transformed dramatically. His home appreciated to $420,000, generating $120,000 in equity gains. His stock portfolio doubled to $400,000, producing $200,000 in investment gains. In total, Robert became $320,000 wealthier over 2 years without doing anything. He didn't work additional hours. He didn't acquire new skills. He didn't start a business or make brilliant investment decisions. He simply owned assets when the Federal Reserve decided to inflate asset prices. Robert and Sarah live in the same economy, governed by the same monetary policies, but their outcomes couldn't be more different. Robert gained $320,000 in wealth, while Sarah lost ground financially and saw her home ownership dreams dissolve. This disparity isn't an unfortunate accident or an unintended side effect. This is precisely how the system is designed to function. The Federal Reserve's policies systematically transfer wealth from people who work for wages to people who own assets. The mechanism is inflation, and it operates as a hidden tax that most people don't understand until they're already impoverished by it. Let's talk about inflation itself, because the government's definition and your lived experience are very different things. The official measure of inflation is the Consumer Price Index, which tracks a basket of goods and services including food, energy, housing, transportation, and medical care. According to official CPI data, inflation from 2020 to 2023 was approximately 18% cumulative. That's the number you hear in news reports and government statements. Prices rose 18% on average over 3 years, they tell you. But this official number dramatically understates the reality experienced by most Americans. And the understatement isn't accidental. Housing, which represents the largest expense for most people, increased far more than 18%. Median home prices rose 35 to 40% depending on the market. Rents increased 25 to 30% in most cities, with some markets seeing even larger spikes. Food prices exploded beyond the official numbers. Eggs increased over 70% at one point. Chicken, beef, bread, milk, and other staples all surged 25 to 50%, depending on the specific item and geographic region. Used car prices jumped 40% in 2021 before falling back slightly, but never returning to pre-pandemic levels. Gasoline prices more than doubled from their 2020 lows to 2022 highs. Healthcare costs continued their relentless upward march. Childcare expenses soared. Every essential category that ordinary people spend money on daily increased far more than the official 18% figure suggests. So why the discrepancy? The CPI calculation includes categories like consumer electronics, which actually decreased in price due to technological improvements and global supply chains. It also uses statistical methods like hedonic adjustments and substitution effects that mathematically reduce the reported inflation rate. Hedonic adjustment means if a new car has more features than last year's model, the price increase is partially attributed to quality improvement rather than pure inflation. Substitution effect means if steak becomes too expensive and consumers switch to chicken, the index assumes you're equally satisfied with chicken at a lower cost, thus reducing measured inflation. These methodologies may be intellectually defensible to economists, but they completely fail to capture the actual degradation of purchasing power experienced by real people buying real things. The government reports 18% inflation, but your grocery bills, rent payments, and gas receipts tell you it's 30 to 40%. Your lived experience is correct. The official statistics are gaslighting you, telling you that inflation isn't as bad as your lying eyes and empty wallets suggest. And when you express frustration about being unable to afford basic necessities that were easily manageable a few years ago, economists and government officials patronizingly explain that inflation is transitory or coming down. But here's the cruel trick buried in that language. When they say inflation is coming down, they mean the rate of price increases is slowing, not that prices are decreasing. If your rent jumped from $1,500 to $2,000, a 33% increase, it's not going back to $1,500. It might stop increasing for a while, stabilizing at $2,000, and economists will celebrate that inflation has been tamed. But you're still permanently paying $500 more per month. That increase is baked in forever. Your purchasing power has been permanently reduced, and it's never coming back. This is the hidden tax that the Federal Reserve imposed on you. Income tax is visible on your paycheck. Sales tax is visible on your receipts. Property tax comes in a bill you can read and understand. But inflation is invisible until you suddenly realize that everything costs dramatically more than it used to. By then, the wealth transfer is complete. The people who owned assets have captured the gains, and you're left struggling to afford groceries while being told the economy is strong and recovering well. The Federal Reserve caused this inflation by expanding the money supply by 50% in 2 years. This is not a controversial statement or a conspiracy theory. They knew that creating $4.5 trillion would devalue the currency. They understood that flooding the financial system with money would cause prices to rise. They did it anyway because their institutional priority is protecting the financial system, meaning banks and asset markets, not protecting your purchasing power. Let me show you how they justified this policy choice at the time. In March 2020, Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell appeared before cameras and announced that the Fed would do whatever it takes to support the economy. Unlimited quantitative easing, zero interest rates, whatever it takes. The rationale presented to the public sounded reasonable and necessary. The economy was indeed in freefall. Businesses were closing by the thousands. Unemployment spiked to 14% as entire sectors of the economy shut down overnight. Stock markets had crashed. Credit markets were freezing up. Without aggressive intervention, Powell argued, America would slide into a depression comparable to the 1930s. The Fed positioned itself as the responsible adult in the room, making tough decisions to prevent catastrophe. But here's the question that nobody in the mainstream media asked, the question that exposes the entire corrupt structure of the system. Why did that $4.5 trillion go to banks and financial institutions instead of directly to the American people? The government did send stimulus checks to individuals, $1,200 in April 2020, $600 in December 2020, $1,400 in March 2021. That's a total of $3,200 per person over the course of a year. These payments were helpful for immediate needs, but completely inadequate to compensate for 30% inflation over the following years. Meanwhile, the Federal Reserve gave $4.5 trillion to financial institutions with no strings attached, no requirements that the money be used for any particular purpose, no oversight to ensure it benefited ordinary Americans. Here's the math that reveals the injustice. $4.5 trillion divided among 330 million Americans equals approximately $13,600 per person. For a family of 4, that would have been $54,400. Imagine if instead of giving banks $4.5 trillion to speculate in asset markets, the Federal Reserve had given every American family $50,000 directly. The housing market probably would have still appreciated because people would have had substantial down payments and purchasing power, but at least ordinary Americans would have participated in the asset appreciation instead of being completely priced out. Workers would have had capital to invest, to pay off debts, to start businesses, to improve their situations. The wealth gains would have been broadly distributed across society instead of concentrated among people who were already wealthy. But that's not how the system works. That's not how it was designed to work. The system is structured to funnel money through banks and financial institutions first. They receive the fresh money first. They deploy it into assets first. They capture the gains first. By the time that money trickles down to ordinary people through wages or employment, asset prices have already adjusted upward. You're always one step behind, always chasing a goal that recedes faster than you can run toward it. This phenomenon is known as the Cantillon effect, named after Richard Cantillon, an 18th century Irish-French economist who observed that when new money enters an economy, the people closest to the source of that money benefit most. They get to spend the new money before prices have adjusted upward. People further from the money source receive it only after prices have already increased throughout the economy. They get the inflation without any of the benefits. In modern terms, banks and financial institutions are closest to the Federal Reserve's money creation. They receive trillions in fresh liquidity and immediately deploy it into assets before prices rise. Asset prices then increase. By the time that money filters through the broader economy to workers in the form of wages, prices have already adjusted upward. Workers might get a 3 or 5% raise, but their costs went up 30%. They are net losers in this arrangement. The Cantillon effect explains why money printing always benefits the wealthy and harms the middle and lower classes. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature of how monetary systems are fundamentally structured when central banks control the money supply. Now let's discuss who actually runs the Federal Reserve and why they designed the system to function this way. The Federal Reserve is technically independent from the government. It's not a government agency like the Department of Treasury or the Internal Revenue Service. It's a quasi-private institution with a unique structure that creates inherent conflicts of interest. There are 12 regional Federal Reserve banks located across the United States. These regional banks are actually owned by private member banks. JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, and other major financial institutions are members and shareholders of the Federal Reserve System. They own stock in their regional Fed banks and receive dividends on that ownership. The Board of Governors, which sets monetary policy and makes the critical decisions about interest rates and quantitative easing, is appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. So there is some governmental oversight and democratic accountability. However, once appointed, Fed governors serve 14-year terms and cannot be removed except for cause, insulating them from political pressure but also from democratic accountability. The chairman serves a 4-year term and can be reappointed. This hybrid structure means the Federal Reserve theoretically serves two masters. Officially, its congressional mandate is to pursue maximum employment and stable prices, serving the broad public interest. But in practice, the Fed is deeply intertwined with and connected to the banking industry it's supposed to regulate. The revolving door between the Federal Reserve and Wall Street spins constantly. Fed officials come from major banks and investment firms. After their government service, they return to lucrative positions in the financial industry. Jerome Powell, the current chairman, was a private equity executive at the Carlyle Group before joining the Fed. Prior to that, he worked at the Treasury Department under George H.W. Bush and at the investment bank Dillon Reed. Janet Yellen, who preceded Powell as Fed chair, is now serving as Treasury Secretary. Before running the Fed, she was a professor at Berkeley and had worked at the Fed in various roles throughout her career. Ben Bernanke, who chaired the Fed during the 2008 financial crisis, came from academia at Princeton, but now works as a senior advisor to Citadel, one of the world's largest hedge funds, and to PIMCO, a major investment management firm. This revolving door creates a structural conflict of interest that corrupts the entire system. If you're a Federal Reserve official and you know that when you leave government service, you might be offered a lucrative position at JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, or a major hedge fund paying millions of dollars annually, are you really going to regulate those institutions harshly? Are you going to implement policies that hurt their profitability? Or are you going to be friendly, supportive, accommodating, and helpful, knowing that your future employment prospects depend on maintaining good relationships with the industry you're regulating? The latter is far more common. The Federal Reserve has been captured by the very industry it's supposed to oversee and regulate. This is called regulatory capture, and it explains why in every financial crisis, the Fed's first instinct is to protect banks and asset markets rather than ordinary people. In 2008, when the financial crisis hit, the Fed bailed out banks with trillions of dollars. Bear Stearns was rescued. AIG received massive support. The major banks were all saved from failure. Millions of ordinary Americans lost their homes to foreclosure, while the banks that caused the crisis were made whole. In 2020, they did it again, even more aggressively. Every single time, the pattern repeats. Crisis hits, markets panic, the Fed prints enormous quantities of money and channels it to banks and financial institutions. Asset prices stabilize or rise. Ordinary people receive token assistance, perhaps a small stimulus check or temporarily extended unemployment benefits, but the bulk of the money always flows to financial institutions. Over time, wealth concentrates at the top of the economic pyramid. Since 2008, the Federal Reserve has printed over $10 trillion cumulatively. $10 trillion created and injected into the financial system over 15 years. And during that same period, wealth inequality in America has become the widest it's been since the 1920s. The wealth share controlled by the top 1% has increased dramatically while the middle class has been hollowed out. This is not a coincidence. These two trends are directly connected. The Federal Reserve's money printing is the primary driver of wealth inequality in the modern era. When you create trillions of dollars and give them to people who already own assets, those assets appreciate and wealth concentrates. It's not complicated. It's the inevitable mathematical outcome of the policy choices made by the Fed. Now let's talk about what this means specifically for you if you're in your 20s or 30s right now. You have been financially destroyed by policies you didn't vote for, implemented by people you didn't elect, to benefit people who already have more money than they could spend in 10 lifetimes. Let me walk you through a detailed scenario that probably describes your situation or that of someone you know well. You graduated from college in 2015, with $40,000 in student loan debt, which is close to the average. You found a job paying $50,000 annually, which is a decent starting salary for a college graduate. Your rent is $1,200 per month in a modest apartment. Your student loan payment is $400 monthly. After all your expenses, you manage to save $500 each month through disciplined budgeting and sacrifice. By 2020, after 5 years of consistent saving, you've accumulated $30,000. You're proud of this accomplishment because most of your peers have nothing saved and are living paycheck to paycheck. You start seriously looking at houses. Homes in your area cost around $300,000. You need $60,000 for a 20% down payment to avoid private mortgage insurance. You're exactly halfway to your goal. You calculate that with 2 more years of saving at your current rate, you'll have the down payment and can finally achieve homeownership. You make spreadsheets, research neighborhoods, and dream about having your own place instead of paying rent that disappears into a landlord's pocket every month. Then, COVID-19 arrives in March 2020. The economy shuts down. You're fortunate enough to keep your job, though raises and promotions are frozen. The Federal Reserve begins printing money on an unprecedented scale. $4.5 trillion flows into the financial system. Housing prices in your area explode upward as investors and existing homeowners with access to cheap credit compete for limited inventory. By 2022, that $300,000 house you had been tracking now costs $420,000. You need $84,000 for a 20% down payment. During those 2 years from 2020 to 2022, you continued saving diligently. You managed to add $12,000 to your account, bringing your total to $42,000. You should feel accomplished, but instead you feel defeated. The target moved from $60,000 to $84,000. You're now only 50% of the way to your goal compared to 50% before. 2 years of saving actually left you further behind in relative terms. But it gets worse. Your rent increased from $1,200 to $1,800 monthly. That's an additional $600 per month, $7,200 annually. That now goes to rent instead of savings. Your monthly grocery bill increased from $300 to $500. That's another $2,400 per year. Gasoline costs went up approximately $1,000 annually. Health insurance premiums increased. Utility bills rose. Every single category of expense expanded significantly. In total, you're now spending approximately $10,000 more per year on basic necessities than you were in 2020. Meanwhile, what happened to your income? Your salary went from $50,000 to maybe $55,000 after 5 years. That's a 10% increase, which sounds okay until you run the numbers. A $5,000 raise translates to maybe $4,000 after taxes. So your income increased by $4,000 annually, but your expenses increased by $10,000 annually. You're now $6,000 per year worse off in real terms. And remember, the house you wanted to buy is now $120,000 more expensive, requiring an additional $24,000 for your down payment. You've been lapped by monetary policy. You're moving backward financially despite doing everything right. You worked hard, saved money, avoided frivolous spending, made responsible choices, and you're further from home ownership now than you were when you started saving. This isn't because you failed. This is because the Federal Reserve inflated asset prices beyond your reach, while simultaneously inflating your living costs and keeping your wages stagnant. You've been systematically impoverished by monetary policy designed to benefit people who already owned assets. Now contrast your situation with someone who was just slightly ahead of you on the economic ladder in 2020. This person owned a house worth $300,000 with a $200,000 mortgage at 3% interest. Their monthly payment was about $1,000. They also had $200,000 invested in index funds tracking the stock market. When COVID hit and the Fed printed money, their house appreciated to $420,000. They gained $120,000 in home equity without lifting a finger. Their stock portfolio doubled to $400,000. They gained another $200,000 in investment returns. Total wealth gain over 2 years, $320,000. They didn't work harder than you. They didn't make smarter decisions. They didn't possess superior financial knowledge. They simply owned assets when the Federal Reserve decided to inflate asset prices. Now they are $320,000 wealthier, while you are $6,000 per year poorer and further from home ownership despite years of disciplined saving. This is the theft I'm describing. It's a systematic transfer of wealth from people who work for wages to people who own assets. The mechanism is inflation, deliberately created by Federal Reserve policy, and the trend is accelerating, not slowing down. Since 1980, wages adjusted for official inflation have increased only about 20%. But asset prices, meaning stocks and real estate, have increased over 500% during that same period. If you earn wages, you're treading water at best. If you own assets, you're getting rich. The system is designed to reward ownership and punish labor. The Federal Reserve's money printing is the engine driving this growing divergence. And the divergence is approaching levels that historically precede social instability and political upheaval. Let's discuss what the Federal Reserve could have done differently, because there were alternatives to the path they chose. They deliberately selected the option that benefited asset owners at the expense of everyone else. First alternative, they could have allowed markets to correct naturally in 2020. Let over-leveraged businesses fail. Let asset prices fall to economically sustainable levels. Allow a genuine price discovery process where assets return to valuations justified by underlying fundamentals rather than speculation fueled by cheap credit. This approach would have been painful in the short term. Unemployment would have remained elevated for longer. Stock markets would have stayed depressed for perhaps 2 or 3 years. Real estate prices would have fallen, possibly by 20 to 30% in overheated markets. Wealthy people would have seen their net worth decline substantially on paper. But within 2 to 3 years, the economy would have experienced a genuine reset. Housing would have become affordable again for young people trying to enter the market. Stock valuations would have returned to reasonable levels supported by actual earnings rather than monetary stimulus. Zombie companies kept alive only by cheap credit would have been liquidated, freeing up resources and workers to be redeployed to more productive uses. The economy would have cleared its excesses and emerged healthier and more sustainable. This is how market economies are supposed to function. Creative destruction eliminates inefficiency and creates space for innovation and growth. Instead, the Federal Reserve chose to prop up everything, keep asset prices artificially elevated, keep failing businesses alive with cheap credit, prevent any significant pain for existing asset owners. And the cost of that decision is being paid by everyone who doesn't own assets, which is the majority of Americans, especially younger generations. You're paying for it through inflation that destroyed your purchasing power. You're paying for it through housing costs that make home ownership impossible. You're paying for it through stagnant wages that haven't kept pace with the rising costs of living. The Fed socialized the pain across the entire working population while privatizing the gains to the wealthy asset-owning class. This is the opposite of capitalism. It's crony capitalism, or perhaps more accurately, financial feudalism, where the rules are rigged to benefit lords while peasants are systematically impoverished. The second alternative would have been to bypass banks entirely and distribute money directly to citizens. If the Federal Reserve had created $4.5 trillion and distributed it evenly to all Americans, every person would have received approximately $13,600. That money would have been spent immediately on rent, mortgages, food, necessities, and paying down debts. It would have supported businesses directly by putting purchasing power in the hands of consumers rather than speculative investors. The economic recovery would have been driven by genuine consumer demand rather than asset price inflation. Yes, some of that money would have eventually found its way into asset markets, potentially driving prices upward. But at least ordinary Americans would have participated in the appreciation instead of being completely shut out. Workers would have had capital to invest for the first time, creating wealth-building opportunities for people who previously had no access to financial markets. Instead, the money went exclusively to banks who used it to buy assets before prices rose. You got priced out while they got rich. This wasn't an accident or an oversight. This was the explicitly intended outcome. The Federal Reserve's mandate, despite the pretty language about maximum employment and stable prices, is fundamentally about protecting the financial system. And the financial system consists of banks, asset markets, and the wealthy individuals and institutions who own them. You're not part of the financial system in their eyes. You're merely a participant in the economy. Those are two completely different categories. And when the Fed has to choose between protecting the financial system and protecting ordinary people, they choose the financial system every single time, without exception. Here's what happens next, and it's not encouraging. The inflation of 2021 to 2023 is permanent. Prices are not coming back down. The Federal Reserve raised interest rates aggressively in 2022 and 2023, taking them from 0 to over 5% in an attempt to combat inflation. These rate increases slowed economic growth. Hiring froze at many companies. Wage growth stalled. Housing market activity declined as mortgage rates soared, but prices stayed elevated. Housing prices plateaued but didn't fall significantly in most markets. Grocery prices remained high. Energy costs stayed elevated. The inflation was baked in, permanently raising the price level throughout the economy. So now you face a double squeeze: high prices and high interest rates simultaneously. If you want to buy that house that costs $420,000, you're now looking at a 7% mortgage rate instead of the 3% rates that were available in 2020 and 2021. Your monthly payment on a $420,000 house at 7% interest is over $3,000. Compare that to a $300,000 house at 3% interest, which was about $1,400 monthly. The same house, or rather a house in the same neighborhood that would have been accessible to you just a few years ago, now costs more than triple per month. Over $3,000 compared to roughly $1,000. And your income didn't triple. It went up maybe 15% over that time period if you were fortunate. The mathematics of home ownership have become completely impossible for a massive segment of the population. This is why approximately 40% of millennials will never own a home. That's not hyperbole or pessimism. That's the mathematical reality based on income levels, savings rates, housing prices, and interest rates. 40% of an entire generation will rent forever, paying landlords every month with nothing to show for it, building no equity, accumulating no wealth through real estate appreciation. And many of those landlords aren't even individuals anymore. They're massive corporate entities like Blackstone and Invitation Homes that purchased tens of thousands of single-family homes during the period of cheap money between 2020 and 2022. These corporations were able to borrow money at 2 to 3% interest rates and use that cheap debt to buy houses in bulk, often paying cash and beating out individual buyers who needed mortgage financing. Blackstone alone owns over 80,000 single-family rental homes across America. Invitation Homes owns approximately 80,000 properties. American Homes. 4. Rent owns another 60,000. These corporate landlords acquired this massive inventory using cheap credit provided indirectly by Federal Reserve policy, and now they're renting these properties at market rates that reflect current inflated prices. They're generating enormous profits with very little risk because they locked in low fixed-rate financing while collecting rents that increase annually with inflation. You're now paying inflated rent to corporate landlords, probably $1,500 to $2,000 monthly or more depending on your market, while simultaneously being unable to buy because both prices and mortgage rates are prohibitively high. You've been systematically locked into permanent renter status by deliberate policy choices made by unelected officials at the Federal Reserve. This isn't a temporary situation that will resolve itself. The structural conditions have fundamentally changed. You've been priced out of asset ownership, likely forever, unless you receive a massive inheritance or somehow dramatically increase your income, neither of which is likely for most people. And here's the truly devastating reality. The Federal Reserve cannot fix this situation now, even if they wanted to, even if they suddenly developed concern for ordinary Americans over banks and asset markets. They're trapped by their own previous decisions. If they cut interest rates back to zero and resume printing money, inflation will spike again immediately. All that fresh liquidity will flood into the economy, driving prices even higher. Housing costs will surge further. Food and energy will become even more expensive. The inflation problem will reignite worse than before because there's already so much money in the system and because inflationary expectations have become embedded in consumer and business psychology. But if they keep interest rates high to control inflation, the economy will slow dramatically. Unemployment will rise as businesses cut costs and reduce hiring. Economic growth will stagnate or turn negative. Consumer spending will decline as people reduce discretionary purchases. Commercial real estate will face a crisis as office buildings remain partially empty and retailers close locations. Small businesses will fail because they cannot service high-interest debt. The economy will slide toward recession, and people will suffer through unemployment and reduced opportunities. There's no good option remaining because the Fed already used all their tools. They printed too much money in response to 2008 and then printed far more in response to 2020. They inflated too many asset bubbles across stocks, bonds, real estate, and private equity. They enabled too much debt accumulation by governments, corporations, and individuals. The system is fundamentally trapped between two terrible outcomes: either massive inflation that destroys the currency's purchasing power, or massive deflation that destroys asset values and triggers a severe recession or depression. Whichever path the economy takes, ordinary people lose. Asset owners at least have a chance if they can hold through volatility and uncertainty. If you own a house and stocks, you have tangible wealth that will likely retain some value regardless of whether we get inflation or deflation. In an inflationary scenario, your assets appreciate nominally even if real returns are poor. In a deflationary scenario, you might see paper losses, but you still own real things rather than just cash. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck with no assets, just trying to afford rent and groceries, you're going to get absolutely crushed regardless of which direction the economy moves. You have no hedge, no protection, no fallback position. You're completely exposed to whatever economic chaos emerges from the Federal Reserve's policy mistakes. This is the theft I want you to understand clearly. $4.5 trillion created by the Federal Reserve between 2020 and 2022. Approximately 95% of it flowed to financial institutions and existing asset owners. Maybe 5% trickled down to ordinary people through stimulus checks that totaled $3,200 per person. Asset prices inflated by 30 to 40% across real estate and equities. Your costs of living went up 30 to 40% for housing, food, energy, and other necessities. Your wages, if you were lucky, went up 5 to 10%. You are now 30% poorer in real terms, measured by what your income can actually purchase. And the people who were already wealthy are 30% richer, measured by the appreciated value of their asset holdings. The wealth gap exploded to levels not seen in a century. Home ownership became unattainable for tens of millions of young Americans who did everything right, but got economically destroyed anyway. And your future got stolen by unelected officials at the Federal Reserve who prioritized protecting banks and asset markets over protecting your purchasing power and economic opportunity. They made a conscious choice to benefit the wealthy at your expense, and they executed that choice through monetary policy that most people don't understand. This isn't a conspiracy theory cooked up by internet cranks. This is documented public policy. The Federal Reserve openly states in their policy statements and research papers that they target higher asset prices because they believe the wealth effect stimulates economic growth. They publish their balance sheet showing the $4.5 trillion they created, available for anyone to review on their website. The inflation data is published monthly by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. The housing price increases are documented by Case-Shiller, Zillow, Redfin, and every other real estate data provider. The wage stagnation is evident in Bureau of Labor Statistics data showing real wage growth has been minimal or negative for most workers. All of this information is publicly available and documented, but most people don't connect these dots. They don't understand that the Federal Reserve's money printing is the direct cause of why they can't afford to buy a house. They don't grasp that inflation is a hidden tax that systematically transferred their wealth to people who already owned assets. They think housing became unaffordable due to supply shortages or zoning laws or foreign investors, which are contributing factors but not the primary driver. They think inflation is just bad luck, or perhaps caused by supply chain disruptions from COVID, or maybe because of greedy corporations raising prices. These factors played minor roles, but the overwhelming cause was monetary expansion. $4.5 trillion created out of nothing and injected into the financial system. People think economic unfairness is just natural, an inevitable feature of capitalism where some people succeed and others struggle. But what we're experiencing isn't natural market capitalism. It's a rigged system, a deliberately engineered outcome where the people who control the money supply use that awesome power to enrich themselves and their friends while impoverishing everyone else who depends on wages rather than assets. The Federal Reserve didn't steal 30% of your money through visible taxation that you could see on your paycheck and potentially vote against. They stole it through inflation, a hidden mechanism that operates silently, transferring your purchasing power to asset owners while you're distracted by daily life, working your job, paying your bills, trying to save money. And unless you understand precisely how this theft mechanism operates, you cannot possibly protect yourself from the next round, because another round is definitely coming. The next crisis, whatever form it takes, will trigger the same response from the Federal Reserve. Markets will panic, asset prices will fall, and the Fed will print money to stabilize the financial system. Trillions more dollars will be created and channeled to banks and institutions. Asset prices will be inflated again, probably to even more absurd levels. Your purchasing power will be devalued further. The wealth gap will widen more, and if you're not positioned correctly with assets to capture those gains, you'll get robbed again, even more thoroughly than last time. So, what can you actually do to protect yourself? First, understand that holding cash is a guaranteed losing strategy over any meaningful time period. Cash sitting in a savings account, earning 1% interest while inflation runs at 5 to 8%, means you're losing 4 to 7% of your purchasing power annually. Your account balance might say you have $50,000, the same number as last year, but that $50,000 buys significantly less than it did 12 months ago. You're getting poorer while the number stays the same. Cash is not a safe haven. It's a melting ice cube. Second, you need to acquire assets of some kind, even small amounts, to participate in the appreciation that occurs when the Fed prints money. This is difficult advice when asset prices are already inflated and you're struggling to save money after paying inflated rent and grocery bills, but it's essential. Even small positions in stocks through index funds or ETFs give you some exposure to equity appreciation. If you can possibly manage to buy any real estate, even a small condo or a house in a less expensive market that requires relocating, do it. Property ownership, even of modest properties, provides inflation protection that renting cannot match. Your mortgage payment stays fixed while rents increase every year, and any appreciation in property value accrues to you rather than a landlord. Third, focus relentlessly on increasing your income rather than just cutting expenses. There's a limit to how much you can save by being frugal, but there's theoretically no limit to how much you can earn. Develop valuable skills that command higher wages. Change jobs strategically because company hopping typically generates larger raises than staying loyal to one employer. Start a side business or freelance work to create additional income streams. Negotiate aggressively for salary increases and don't accept the typical 2 to 3% annual raise that doesn't even keep pace with inflation. Income growth is your primary tool for escaping the trap. Fourth, recognize that debt is not always bad in an inflationary environment. This goes against conventional wisdom about avoiding debt, but the math changes when you understand monetary dynamics. If you can borrow at 5% interest to buy an asset that appreciates at 8%, you're making money. More importantly, you're repaying that debt with future dollars that are worth less than today's dollars due to ongoing inflation. A 30-year mortgage locked at a fixed rate becomes easier to pay over time as your income hopefully increases with inflation while the payment stays the same. The wealthy understand this principle and use it constantly. You should too, carefully and strategically. Fifth, do not trust the government's inflation numbers or economic narratives. Trust your own experience. If your grocery bills doubled and your rent increased 40%, that's your reality, regardless of what the CPI claims. Make financial decisions based on actual costs you're experiencing, not official statistics designed to minimize the appearance of problems. The government has strong incentives to understate inflation because Social Security payments, government pension obligations, and many other programs are indexed to official inflation measures. Lower reported inflation saves the government trillions in obligations. They're not going to accurately report numbers that cost them money. Sixth, educate yourself about monetary policy and economics. You cannot protect yourself from a system you don't understand. Read about the Federal Reserve, how money creation works, what quantitative easing actually does, how inflation transfers wealth. This knowledge is power. Most people remain in financial darkness, perpetually confused about why they're struggling despite working hard. You now understand the mechanism. That understanding allows you to make better decisions and position yourself correctly for whatever comes next. The uncomfortable truth is that the system is designed to benefit people who already have assets and systematically impoverish people who only have their labor to sell. The Federal Reserve, despite its official mandate about employment and stable prices, operates primarily to protect the financial system, meaning banks and asset markets. Every crisis response follows the same pattern. Print money, give it to financial institutions, inflate asset prices, create wealth for people who already own things, and leave everyone else to deal with the inflation and reduced purchasing power. This has been happening since the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, but it has dramatically accelerated since 2008, when the Fed embraced quantitative easing as standard policy. The pace of wealth transfer has increased exponentially. What used to take decades now happens in just a few years. An entire generation, millennials and now Gen Z, have been economically destroyed by policies they didn't vote for, cannot change through normal political processes, and mostly don't even understand. You're living through the largest wealth transfer in human history, and it's being executed in plain sight using technical language that obscures what's actually happening. The establishment economists, financial media, and politicians will never explain this to you clearly because they benefit from the current system. They own assets. They're connected to the financial industry. They have access to cheap credit and investment opportunities. They're on the winning side of the wealth transfer. Why would they expose and criticize a system that's making them rich? They won't. They'll continue using phrases like necessary monetary accommodation and quantitative easing to support market functioning and unconventional policy tools that make it sound technical and complicated when the reality is simple theft dressed up in sophisticated language. You were robbed. $4.5 trillion was created and given to people who didn't need it while you struggled to save money that was being devalued even as it sat in your account. Housing became unaffordable not because of shortages, but because newly created money flooded into real estate faster than you could save. Your grocery bills doubled because 40% more dollars are chasing roughly the same amount of goods. Your wages stagnated while asset owners got 30% richer because the system is designed to reward ownership and punish labor. The Federal Reserve executed this wealth transfer deliberately, knowing exactly what would happen, choosing to protect banks and markets over protecting you. And it's going to happen again unless something fundamental changes about how monetary policy works in this country, which seems unlikely given the entrenched interests and captured regulatory systems. The next crisis, whether it's triggered by commercial real estate defaults, credit card debt defaults, stock market crash, banking crisis, or some unforeseen black swan event, will prompt the same response. The Federal Reserve will print trillions more. They'll give it to financial institutions. Asset prices will be inflated again. And if you're not positioned with assets to capture those gains, you'll be robbed again, falling even further behind while being told the economy is recovering and everything is fine. This is your financial reality. Understanding it is the first step toward protecting yourself. The second step is taking action, acquiring assets even when it seems impossible, increasing income aggressively, using debt strategically, and positioning yourself on the right side of the wealth transfer. The third step is helping others understand what's happening, because this system only persists because most people don't grasp how it works. The more people who understand that inflation is theft, that the Federal Reserve serves banks rather than citizens, that monetary policy is the primary driver of wealth inequality, the more pressure there might eventually be for meaningful reform. But don't hold your breath waiting for reform. The system is working exactly as designed from the perspective of the people who run it. They're getting richer. Their assets are appreciating. Their banks are profitable. Their stock portfolios are growing. They have no incentive to change anything. The burden is on you to understand the game being played and position yourself accordingly. The rules are rigged, but you can still win if you know what the rules actually are, rather than what you're told they are. The theft happened. $4.5 trillion from 2020 to 2022, over $10 trillion since 2008. Your purchasing power was destroyed. Housing became unaffordable. Your savings were devalued. The wealthy captured massive gains. The wealth gap exploded. And this pattern will continue until the system breaks entirely or people finally understand what's being done to them and demand fundamental change. Until then, protect yourself, acquire assets, increase income, and stop playing by rules designed to keep you poor while making others rich. This has been the story of the greatest theft in American history, executed in plain sight by the Federal Reserve, stealing 30% of your wealth and transferring it to people who were already rich. You now understand exactly how it happened, who did it, who benefited, and why you're permanently poorer. The question is, what you're going to do with this knowledge. If this information opened your eyes to the systematic wealth extraction happening through monetary policy, do me a favor and hit that like button so more people can discover this content and understand what's really happening to their financial futures. Drop a comment below sharing your own experience with housing prices, inflation, and the struggle to build wealth in this rigged system. Your story matters, and others need to hear they're not alone in this struggle. And if you want more content exposing the financial mechanisms designed to keep ordinary people poor while enriching the already wealthy, subscribe to this channel and hit the notification bell. The theft is ongoing, and I'll continue documenting exactly how it operates and what you can do to protect yourself. The system is rigged, but knowledge is power. Share this video with everyone you know who's struggling to understand why working hard no longer leads to financial security. Together, we can expose the truth about how modern monetary policy systematically impoverishes workers while enriching asset owners. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hey everyone, I'm working to hit 1,000 subscribers and I need your help to get there. If you enjoy this content, please hit that subscribe button right now.